So now let's start with, there is a story about Kenya's coastline. Where does it begin? Where did the drama begin? Who owned what? Where does it start from?
All right. The story of Kenya's coastline cannot be told in isolation from the East African coast, the interior of East Africa, and the countries that we know today as Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and of course Somalia. But our story for today will concentrate on the Kenyan coast. And the story again of Kenyan coast cannot be told without reference to the history and the long association with Zanzibar. So where do we begin then? We must begin where it starts. Now, Zanzibar was a very important city and center of both trade and colonial influence in East Africa, because Zanzibar is a very old place, and it is on the route. It is situated on the route, the sea route to the Far East. In the early days, there was no Suez Canal as we know it. So vessels from Europe to Asia, particularly India and China, had to go around the Cape of Good Hope, come up to the coast of East Africa, and inevitably find themselves in Zanzibar, where they could pause, rest, replenish, restock, and then cross the Indian Ocean, which is a long distance, into the continent of Asia, starting from India. Therefore, for a long time, millennia in fact, Zanzibar had exchanges with a lot of people. I have mentioned Europe, but there was also a lot of traffic coming from what we call today the Middle East, the Arab countries, the Gulf. And in fact, the first cultural interaction in Zanzibar and the East African coast as a whole came from the Middle East, and in particular, the Arab states, with the special reference to Oman. And in history, we used to be told about the trade winds. There was no steamship at that time. So people and traders used to move by what we call dhows. They are still existing in Mombasa and Lamu and places. They are still going. The dhows could only move if there was a strong wind. And therefore, there was the northwest wind, which drove them up, and there was the southwest, the so-called monsoons, that used to bring those ships during that one season into East Africa. So they used to bring trade goods from those countries and then take what was then the goods that were not manufactured, but obtainable in this part of the world. Now, as a result of exchanges over many years, the Omani people settled in Zanzibar and found the climate very agreeable. And they brought an administration, and they established the normal administrative organs of state, including their judiciary, languages, and of course their language, Islam. Established mosques, madrasas, and so on. Now, when the first missionaries came and wanted to go into the interior, their first stop was Zanzibar, because that's where they could get set up base for their voyages, or rather their expeditions to the interior. And they used, if we can look at the map of East Africa, particularly the coast, you'll find that Zanzibar Island is very close to the coast of Tanzania. And in fact, Zanzibar town is directly opposite the town of Bagamoyo in Tanzania, just north of Dar es Salaam. And therefore, the port of entry to many of these missionaries first was Bagamoyo into the interior. And they traveled along what we call today the Central Corridor, through from Bagamoyo into Morogoro, going to Tabora, and on to Lake Tanganyika, to then Ujiji, and then they would go to Uganda from the west of Lake Victoria. The other route that they used after that, which was less common, was to cross from Zanzibar into Mombasa and then trek up the route from Mombasa to Voi, coming up to Machakos, and then Nairobi. Nairobi, of course, didn't exist in what we know, and then off through. But the fear at that time, which I believe in opinion may have been misplaced, was that there was a story of the Maasai people of the interior of Kenya being very wild, and they were described as warlike. So most missionaries and traders didn't feel very comfortable having a caravan up here until much later. So you see the exchanges started from there, trade, and then came the slave trade. And the slaves were collected from the interior and traveled through the same caravan routes into Mombasa and then across to Zanzibar. And in the central corridor from the interior of Africa to Bagamoyo and then across to Zanzibar. And Zanzibar was actually the central market for slave trade. And if you go to Zanzibar today, the first thing that you see is a yard, a big, an open ground, where there was a slave auction ground. That is where the auction, people came from all over, the traders, to buy slaves at the auction. So the traders who had brought the slaves from the interior could sell them there and then go for another cargo into the interior. So Zanzibar, you see, is growing to a very important commercial and a political capital.
So it was more popular than Mombasa as an entry point.
Yes,
at this
Mombasa
time.
was inferior to Zanzibar.
Now, let me ask you,
Yes.
when all this is happening, first, around what year are we talking? Is this?
We are talking in the year 1700, late 1770 there to early 1800.
Okay. My next question is: at this time, with these things happening, who owned this area? If it's the entry points, who was not even owned, who controlled them? And two, just clarify for us what is the connection between Zanzibar and Mombasa.
Good. I will try my best to do so. Now, the era of colonialism started after the missionaries, Christian missionaries came, they were followed by the traders and then the so-called explorers who were looking for what was available. Some of them came in the name of their kings, were sponsored by private investors to see whether there are resources that could be exploited. So what we read as explorers, the big ones, came in to see. And they came from different European countries. We read about the British ones, There were also German ones, and Portuguese had been here for a very long time. And Europe realized that it was very interesting. It had a future. They have our own countries now. And they saw that they needed to divide this region into their own sphere of influence so that they can exploit without conflict among themselves. So as you probably have heard or know, the European powers held a conference called the Berlin Conference in 1885 to partition Africa among themselves. Because even the French were there in West Africa, the Portuguese were there, the British were there, and they saw they would have conflict if they don't settle. So they had this conference in Berlin, and they sat down at a table. The map of Africa was placed there in a rough manner, and they cut it like a cake among themselves. They said, you take that, you take this, you take this little piece. And as a result of that, the European governments now could seriously take that as an extension of their interests as a colony. And they could bring settlers, they could bring traders in their various areas of influence. So in East Africa, in our own country, Kenya was one of the most sought after areas. They saw a dream like they could make Kenya look like England and settle there. So they saw very long-term dreams where Kenya could be a little extension of Britain.
But why Kenya particularly?
When they looked after their exploration and so on, they saw good land, they saw good resources, and many areas of Kenya was very fit for their own settlement, and for their own settlement, land, farming, so on. And they could see, and not tourism at that time, but mainly what they could do about settling, even living. They saw a very good country to live in.
Was it only the Brits who were interested in Kenya, or were there other bids?
When they sat down in Berlin, they agreed. If there was no Berlin, perhaps there could have been a struggle.
But before Berlin is what I mean. Was there anyone else scrambling for Kenya
Yes,
particularly?
yes, yes, yes. The Germans were in Tanzania at that time. They were looking at what is called, by that time it was called Tanganyika. They were looking, in fact, the war, when they started fighting among themselves, targeted Taveta. Those areas, they started incursions. The Somali area was an Italian colony. The Italians were also hoping to expand into Kenya. The Arabs who had Zanzibar and the coastal strip of Kenya, they were hoping to consolidate themselves there. So if there was no Berlin, I think these struggles would have continued, and there would have probably been violence, fights, battles, maybe war among themselves for Kenya.
So that time, who was controlling the Kenyan coastline?
Kenyan coastline, to go back a bit in history, when the Sultan, let me explain the Sultan. The Zanzibar I talked about when the people of Oman and Middle East came to settle in Zanzibar, they found it very well, and it was producing a very important crop at that time. Agricultural farms. It is the clove, and this clove had very high value, and the trade was attracting a lot of traders because it is used for food. It's like an additive, it's a spice which was in great demand in Asia and the Arab world for food. So Zanzibar was a major producer of clove, and it was sought after very much. So they controlled that, and then, as I said, they settled down, they established an administration, And then when the trade was with the interior, so inevitably they had contacts and influence in Mombasa and settlement as well. Some of their people moved on the coastline along, and therefore they had the cultural, historical ties and influence and trade. Now, when the Berlin Conference agreed this would go low, so this would take this power would take this piece of Africa, there like this. Zanzibar was allocated to the British. They say they want Zanzibar for themselves, and then they established, because already there was a Sultan and so on. They established a protectorate. They say they are going to protect Zanzibar, but they will be the overlords. Unlike Kenya, which was a colony, they were coming to settle and live here forever. There was no feeling any time that there will be an African or a local or an indigenous person ever ruling here. It didn't even occur in their dreams. No, it was a long-term British settlement. Now, Zanzibar had established influence along the coastline. And when the British took over as a protectorate, they respected the influence that the Zanzibaris had on the coastline. And at that time, the coast, the what you call the Sultan's territory, extended from the Zanzibar, Pemba, the two islands, and then on the coastline, it's extended from our border, Kenya border with Somalia, at a place called Ras Kamboni or Dar es Salaam. There is a little town called Dar es Salaam on the coastline, Kiunga there,
Okay.
in Lamu, in today's Lamu, that little corner. That's where the influence, the control, the territory of the Sultan started. And it moved from the sea, the point at the sea, 10 miles inland. And that strip came from Lamu all the way to Kilifi, 10 miles, Mombasa Island, of course, and then 10 miles inside, going to Kwale, all the way to Vanga, Lungalunga.
So ideally, Kenya was landlocked.
The Kenya at that time was landlocked. But because at independence, we didn't control anything, the British controlled both Kenya and Zanzibar. It was okay, it was the same administration doing the same thing. The question would arise when Kenya demanded independence from Britain. And it was realized that Kenya, there would be a problem if Kenya was to become a country without a coastline, without landlocked.